and thank you for joining us for our 2020 Summit. I'm going to introduce Tom Harris, who's the Vice President and Chief Audit Executive for National Cine Media, a publicly held Denver, Colorado-based cinema and digital media company. His creative and collaborative audit approach combines lean philosophies with practical insights to address and mitigate key risks that the organization faces. He's a strategic thinker with diverse leadership experiences across several industries, not only in internal audit, but Tom also possesses operational management experience in global manufacturing, supply chain, and product development. He's a resourceful and passionate problem solver whose audit departments deliver perceived and measurable value add that management truly appreciates. So I'm going to hand it over to Tom now.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Linda. So this seminar is really to talk a little bit about how internal audit departments can not just be innovative, but also develop a brand to be innovative. It's really important to set the expectations with your stakeholders and understand what they're looking for. So as we kind of walk through the different things, I've tried to focus on case studies and examples, and hopefully this will be useful. You can reach me on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to talk about some ideas. I'm always happy to kick some things around and see how the profession can get a little bit better. So today we'll have some introductions. We'll talk a little bit about what innovation means, the case studies, which is what I'm hoping the bulk of our conversation will be, how to communicate innovation to the business, and then just a recap about what we learned. And for discussions and questions, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. So I'm the Vice President and Chief Audit Executive for National Cine Media. I've been auditing for quite a while, started in the last century. So that's back when high tech was carbonless audit reports. And we've come a long way since then. And you know, in those years that we've been working together with business, we've learned quite a bit about what the business wants and how internal audit can serve those purposes. National Cine Media is a cinema and digital, oops, it jumped. So one of the things I like about internal audit is that we do solve problems. Often the problems that the business doesn't even know they have, and we do it in ways that they just can't understand. Our motto is that we connect brands to movie audiences, and our mission, NCM's mission, is to unite brands with the power of movies and engage movie fans anytime and anywhere. That anytime and anywhere piece really speaks to our digital business. It's not just the large screen where we do advertising and where we connect with consumers. It's also on the small screen and over the TV and other areas that we can deliver advertising. Here's our values. We have a lot of fun with the movies: honor, innovation, collaboration, and accountability. A lot of those values really come into play when it comes to how internal audit does its work and how we interact with the business. So some of the nuances with National Cine Media, we, as mentioned, we are in theater and digital. Our in-theater cinema is really strongly correlated with movie attendance, and as you can imagine, with theaters shut since the beginning of March, we've had some significant revenue impacts and that's got a ripple effect throughout the organization. We have a very complex revenue recognition environment. It's challenging to track the number of impressions actually delivered against forecasts, against contracts. How we recognize those, when we recognize those is a pretty big part of our financial reporting abilities. We're technology dependent. We've got about 20 different custom applications that we use, and those applications track contracts, they track delivery, they establish playlists for the 21,000 different screens, they track attendance, they generate our revenue recognition, and really play a big piece into the content that we deliver and how we interact with our consumers. And we're a fairly complex capital structure. We are an LLC, half owned by NCMI, which is NCM Inc., which is a publicly traded company, and the other half owned by our founding members, which are the largest cinema theater chains in the country, AMC, Regal, and Cinemark. So kind of jumping into what does innovation mean? And this is really where the rubber kind of hits the road, because when we talk about wanting to be innovative and delivering value to the organization, each organization is a little bit different, and the different stakeholders within the organization have different expectations. So with what it means, just starting at the top with auditors, be that staff, management, external auditors, there's a difference. Each of them have different kind of expectations. Staff and line auditors might think innovation has more to do with clear work instructions or expectations of work papers, or maybe how audit quality is defined. Audit management and audit leadership might look for better audit progress tracking, better dashboarding of metrics, easier follow-up, better tracking of open findings. And external auditors, they may have an entirely different approach. I've found that external auditors generally want a stable, reliable work environment. They want a reliable control framework where deliverables are consistent, assessments are done the same way. Change isn't necessarily good for external auditors. Some of the tools and techniques that auditors, internal auditors might be looking for would be GRC tools that automate the SOX cycle, how the risk control matrix is managed with stakeholders, external audit, a common place where they might go to update the different control descriptions and the different testing, how PBCs, the provided by client, the documentation requests are provided and follow the link so that auditors can get to that documentation and do the testing. Other tools and techniques might include automated scheduling and time reporting, more accurate time tracking, ease of time tracking, ease of reporting on minus over budget versus actual. Those are things that typically the internal audit department management is going to look for. External auditors, you know, they might be, on the other hand, see innovation a little bit differently. We've worked with our external audit group to lean, we call it lean, the SOX framework, where we've been able to reduce the number of controls, maybe make the controls a little bit more robust so that when a control is performed, it makes a lot more sense in how it's evidenced. And not only is it easier for stakeholders, but it's also a little bit easier for our external audit department. Next would be audit recipients. And you know, their expectations for innovation is a little bit different than the audit department, as you can imagine. First and foremost, hassle-free audits, right? So the time commitments that we make and we ask of them are fair, they're projected or even less. We eliminate the gotcha moments where we identify improvements and findings at the exit conference. Much better to do that during the audits and give them an opportunity to address those and answer any questions. Ultimately, audit recipients want business partners, not antagonists. And I know that's something that internal audit has been pushing for quite a while, but how the audit recipients perceive that is often as important as our approach. For the C-suite and senior management, you know, a lot of their expectations have to do with how we interact with the leaders. You know, at NCM, our C-suite is, we have two groups. We have the ELT, which is the executive leadership teams, the top 9 leaders. And there's another group, the senior leadership team, which is about 30 to 35 leaders. So all in 40 to 45 people within the company. They're all key customers, and they all help if AI delivers on its promises. So I do think it's important to interact with all of those leaders on a regular basis and to win them in one way or another. So after you've identified who they are, identifying what they want is really important. And mostly they just don't want to have to worry about internal audit. Sometimes if you're lucky, IA might be a tool for them to get things done, to solve problems, to get better perspective on issues, and to provide an independent opinion. So really understanding what kind of C-suite you have is important to understanding what they might think of innovating auditing. Audit committees, you're those folks in that ivory tower, most concerned with a lot of theoretical discussions of matters that might not impact day-to-day work life. Most important reporting structure is getting the audit committee's acceptance of internal audit's initiatives, and that's very critical. And critical to that is the CFO. So anytime you have a conversation about what the CFO or what the audit committee is asking for, it's important that you include the CFO in that, because the CFO sets the tone, the agenda for the committee meetings, and has overall budgeting responsibility and balances investment priorities. CFO typically has much more frequent, regular communications with the audit committee. Internal audit might speak to the audit committee several times a quarter. The CFO is typically speaking with them a couple times a week or even daily. So while technically internal audit reports to the audit committee, the truth is that if the CFO ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. So what does innovation mean to the audit committee and the C-suite? It really depends. And the only way to find out is to ask difficult questions. And those questions often expose some of the underbelly of internal audit. How do we get better? What are internal audit's weaknesses? What ways has internal audit not served the business very well? These kinds of questions can open the door about what IA's capabilities are, and maybe what some of its weaknesses are. So be ready when you have that conversation. When I first started at NCM, I did a voice of the customer survey during the first 90 days, and it was very insightful to help me and set the tone with the business leaders. And I encourage audit departments to periodically do a voice of the customer survey, because without having that regular formal feedback on the direction of the department and what it's intending to do, it's easy to get lost and to not necessarily deliver the value in an innovative way that it's expected of them. Last, of course, is the regulators, and typically they have their own agenda, and that may not be apparent at first. Believe it or not, some of those regulators might have their own goals, and it might not be aligned with the regulatory authority. So management can use regulatory compliance as reasons to push back on doing things a little bit differently. So what does it mean? Well, different expectations, different definitions from throughout our entire group of stakeholders. And branding the department as innovative is all about stakeholder perception. And it's achievable, but it's only by asking and acting. So with that definition, we're going to jump into some case studies here. I've picked 4 of them that these are all hypothetical. Let's just call them hypothetical. The first has to do with consulting on systems implementation. There's a lot of different systems implementations occurring these days. When I started an audit last century, systems wouldn't be implemented except every few years. It would be kind of a black box sort of thing where the organization wouldn't hear about it until IT was ready to roll it out. A lot of things has changed since then. There's almost always some type of an implementation going on, some type of a system upgrade or modification, and there's a great opportunity for internal audit to provide some services there. And doing it in an innovative way, it really pushes the envelope and it stretches the organization, but it's much more helpful. Risk assessment for cutting edge functions. Oftentimes there's a department or a group of the organization that's off trying to do something completely different. And when you perform an audit there, we have one finding, and that finding is to develop some procedures and understand your risks. Those kinds of audits with those kinds of findings don't really help the organization. So we'll take a look at this as a example of how you can kind of get past that do things better and then leaving. Reporting audit results, let's face it, audit reports are something that we do a lot, we do frequently, they're open to criticism quite a bit, and there's some ideas here that I would encourage departments to look at, and some opportunities for making things a little bit better for our stakeholders. And then last would be kind of a short list of simple actions for innovative internal audit. These are things you might be doing right now, but because they haven't been rolled out and discussed, they might just be flying under the radar and the stakeholders are taking it for granted. So jumping into the systems implementation. So the innovation is to take an advisory or consulting approach throughout the development of the implementation cycle, to really to partner with the business, become vested in the project's success. A lot of folks view this as a potential to lose our independence, and there is a risk. That's one of the risks of taking this approach. But I don't think internal audit by its nature should be separate from the project's success. We want that project to succeed. And there's a lot of reasons for it, from improved controls to better operations to better efficiency. The question is, do we, how we approach that, do we lose our independence or do we maintain our independence and still help the organization deliver a successful project? So why would this be innovative? Consulting and advisory approach. So from my experience, there's 5 primary audit approaches. All of these, methodology assessment, key phase review, project risk assessment, pre-launch readiness, post-implementation review, they all have something in common. And I'll kind of break these down a little bit. When you look at the different kinds of methodologies, you've got SDLC, system development lifecycle. It's kind of a waterfall approach for primary assessment phases. There's agile methodology for development, which is a much lighter weight process framework. There's PMBOK, which is very heavy. So all of these different methodologies, assessing how they work is typically done after the fact, because it's more of a compliance audit. You have this methodology, did the project comply with what they were supposed to do? Key phase review, periodic checkpoints, and they only review certain areas, and they should focus on high risk areas, but maybe not necessarily. They often test compliance to establish processes, and a lot of times remediation of the issues prior to go live just isn't done. Project risk assessments, they focus on a particular project. They're limited in scope to really just assessing how the organization looked at project risks and how they responded to it. These days, project teams are doing their own risk assessments, which is very good, but when they're done by the project team, oftentimes they're not as comprehensive. And when IA does its assessment of the risk assessment, it comes across as just nitpicking. So follow-up the gaps and risks are often overlooked. And again, merging risks aren't captured because updates aren't done during the project life. The third one, pre-launch risk assessment, it's focused on a particular project. It's broad, it doesn't go very deep, and it assesses readiness. Typically, it's often just a checklist. It's performed almost all development project work are completed. Major issues always result in schedule and budget hits, and it may not validate remediation prior to go live. The last post-implementation review, it's focused on a particular project. It can be scoped either partially or fully. And historically, this is the auditing approach that's used most often. But I think it provides the least value to an organization because, first of all, while it's more traditional in approach, it's not agile, it's not nimble. It's an after-the-fact review. We find significant issues. They're difficult and expensive to make changes, and they almost always result in either issues not being resolved to go live or lessons learned that are saved until next time. And of course, next time might be another 10 years when you do a GL implementation. So these things have in common, they're all backward looking. They always find the issues that have happened afterwards, which typically has an expensive and schedule impact to resolving them prior to go live. So why is this approach, advisory and consulting, innovative? And what do the stakeholders think about it? Well, comments about a tremendous opportunity to provide value to the business. We've heard folks say that it was too risky, crossed the line of independence. But the truth is, it provides value to the business and it sets the stage to do other cool things. So auditors, be that staff or management, and even external auditors, they think it's a pretty cool approach. Audit recipients, this is my favorite response. I did hear this in a meeting. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So it allows the audit recipients to interact with audit during the implementation. And it's some of the responses with our audit recipients is they weren't sure why internal audit was involved in the early stages. They asked, shouldn't we show up after the work is done and criticize us then? Initially, the audit recipients typically aren't happy. They haven't provided it within the upfront time needed and effort to support internal audit interactions. But having said that, they're happy to have discussions about control impacts. They're happy to have discussions about how process should be designed. And they're happy to have discussions about user access and a lot of the more significant controls that you expect to have at go live. So while initially audit recipients might not be so open to it, as you perform the work, they do get a little more comfortable with the type of help that you can provide and some of the insights you can bring. The C-suite, one of the things that we did notice with the C-suite is that they wanted internal audit's involvement during the project because they expected controls designed in before the launch. They wanted internal audit stamp of approval. And they also realized that this approach can help avoid a critical audit later down the road. So in the example that I'm providing here, they got all of that. They got cost savings, so the CFO was happy. There was a minimal schedule slip. IT and finance was happy. The effective controls for finance, they were happy. External audit was happy. So while we are talking about a hypothetical example, the stakeholders were happy. Audit committee, let's face it, they had fewer and unsurprising external audit comments, and they were just happy that management was happy. And the regulators, they still didn't care. So advantages. Just kind of walking through some of the advantages of the advisory consulting approach, it becomes pretty obvious that it delivers some things that you can't get to in any other project risk assessment. But the biggest problem, of course, that it introduces new risks. Internal audit's loss of independence for certain aspects of the control environment is certainly a big risk. The time required to attend meetings, participate in working sessions far exceeds other approaches. It's a commitment that internal audit has to make. And in the time that internal audit is working on this, they can't be addressing other kinds of problems. And one of the bigger risks is that internal audit shares ownership if things go badly. The caveat is if we provide advice that isn't followed, we need to capture that so that we can identify where we saw risks and how the business didn't respond. So for this particular hypothetical problem, we saw a 3-week slip in a launch date. It was a multi-year project. We were under budget just a tad, but we did reduce the budget. End user satisfaction was high, key controls were in place, and we have a platform where we can deploy enhanced and more controls. Overall, a subjective project grade, also based on the survey, is an A-. That's pretty good. That's pretty good with system implementations. The next idea here, the next case study, would be the risk assessment for cutting edge functions. I'll let you read through the AWS definition of DevOps, but ultimately software developers saw this as a way to just eliminate all controls. So you can see if you go in and do an audit, you really don't have anything to audit against except best practices. There's no compliance, there's no policy, there's no procedures there. It's kind of a free-for-all. So the intended outcome with this is really to deliver tools for the business, tools for developers to understand the risks that they're taking, and then controls for how to utilize those risks. In other words, you're going to partner with the business and deliver tangible tools that they can use. It's not an audit, it's kind of consulting, but it's really helping them understand the impact of their lack of controls. In this hypothetical project that we did, it wasn't successful in the traditional sense because we weren't actually able to deliver a lot of those tools that we'd planned from the start. But there were a lot of intangibles. We did provide a questionnaire that helped the digital developers understand what the impacts were, and they could make some more informed decisions about risks that they were willing to take. A lot of intangibles came out of it. We built a very stronger, more resilient relationships prior to the project. It would be difficult for the senior VP of digital development to take a call from me. Now I can pick up the phone and we have a very good conversation. We gained credibility as a business partner. We were able to rely upon the culture of NCM, and we did a really good job of developing some shared expectations. So I'll take it. You know, was it traditionally successful? No. But if you remember, one of our NCM values is innovation. So having that discussion about the project within the concept of our innovative values, we're not afraid to take risks. We're not afraid of failure if we're pursuing innovation. Next would be reporting audit results. And for me, this is really an interesting exercise when it comes to capturing what you did as an audit and also capturing the attention of the stakeholders. So I love this quote here. Tell me everything I need to know, but nothing more, in a way that speaks my peculiar business language, said the over 50 senior and executive leaders. It's a difficult challenge to do that. So here's a hypothetical problem. 250 hours of audit work, complex technical factors, a slip in schedule to a strategic critical system. You have 3 minutes to get their attention. So what message do you provide to them that resonates? Is it something like this? And you don't have to read all of that, but you can kind of get a set when you put that in an audit report, when you have that conversation in a meeting, eyes will glaze over and you won't get very far. As Winston Churchill said, the report by its very length defends itself against the risk of being read. So how about a different approach? How about something like this, where you identify what the expectation is, lessened risk and resource requirements as you go up towards end to end. And then you look at what the result of your testing is that shows you're going to increase risks and resource requirements. So this picture took a lot less time than that verbiage to read, but it resonated in a way that senior management really got it. So here's some of the comments. You know, we want the triangle, we got the martini glass, and they get it. They're going to need some martinis. So it was an interesting conversation to have about why the project is where it was at. We didn't spend a lot of time explaining what the finding was. That was self-evident with the image and with the way it connected. So we spent time about talking about what do we do about it and how do we go from here. Next is the simple stuff, really. These are simple actions for IA. Some of the simple things, flexible and adaptive audit planning, creating space in the schedule specifically for innovative projects. Just listing it out there. We're going to do innovation. It's going to take us 100 hours. This is what we think it's going to look like. Accepting management requests, seeking them out, putting those in the audit plan. And never saying no to a management request, because there's almost always something that you can do to provide some service to senior management when they have a question. And of course, audit differently. We have multiple methodologies that we use depending on the type of audit. There's compliance audits. Everybody knows about those. Full scope audits. It's formal. We evidence audit work. We have the typical cycles, planning, fieldwork, reporting, follow-up. We use these when external audit relies upon our work. We also have lean or agile audits. They're quick, impactful results, fluid planning and field work cycles, time budget. Very important to this is to have experienced auditors because they need to know what they do. They need to have a sense about where the risks are and how to get at those. We also use consulting projects. I think I've given a couple of examples of those where we try to cut through a lot of the stuff that is impeding the business from making progress. The hard stuff, and everybody hears about this, right? Solve problems, don't just identify them. Well, how do you do that, right? A lot of it has to do with clarifying internal audit's intent. The two biggest lies in business, and I know some of you heard this before. Internal audit comes in and says, we're from internal audit and we're here to help. And the second biggest lie is, great, we're so glad you're here. And it's really hard to overcome these perceptions, but having a good sense of humor and reiterating who we are here to serve, it helps kind of cut through that. The last one, this is very challenging, but I think it's important. Develop a value proposition. What does your internal audit department's brand mean to you? It gives the business permission to expect more. Developing a return on investment. Is it reasonable to expect ROI on all internal audit spend? I think so. The C-suite thinks so. The audit committee thinks so. But what does that mean, right? Can you verbalize it? Can you calculate it? What if it's even negative? Even if it's negative, I think it's important to recognize that you delivered return to the business. You spent $1 million on audit, didn't get a return, spent $1 million on audit, got 400,000 back. It's negative, but it still delivers. So communicating the brand, speak the language. This is really the important part. There's a wonderful example about how the business didn't want to perform and evidence controls when it came to software testing. They said it was waste. Evidencing and controls, performing those steps was just a waste of time. It was only done for audit. Nobody really wants that. And no matter how much I tried to convince them otherwise, it wasn't until I said, well, what is waste? That's the language of lean. Waste is whatever the customer isn't willing to pay for. So the project sponsors are customers, right? And the CFO, the controller, the audit committee, they're willing to pay for these controls, right? So it's kind of interesting because once I started to speak their language, that team really committed to performing the controls, and it changed the discussion. So not all opportunities are created equal. As you work through the senior management, have you identified them? Have you found your allies and detractors? Communicate with them regularly. Call out how IA has saved them money, simplified their work, solved a problem that they asked about. It's important to have that regular communication with the allies and detractors, the people that you get along great with, and the people that don't have a good view of internal audit. Other C-suite members, really a much more focused approach on specific audits and events. And of course, communication with the CFO, formal meetings, informal meetings, how to communicate to the audit committee through the CFO. I think communication with the CFO is probably the most important, and to develop a relationship with that person is very critical. Presentations, I call these high value and high risk. Topics to include are critical. You have to choose. And really, when it comes to some of the stuff that you want to present, it's difficult to understand where they're coming from. You shouldn't expect that they've read your reports or your memos, but not even the stuff you think they want to know about are stuff they want to know about. So unless the house is on fire and there's family inside, let the audit committee control the direction and tempo and length of the discussion. Annual performance reviews. This is something that a lot of us just think is a rote exercise that we need to get through at the end of the year, but it's really important to speak about how the department is making life better up, down, and across the organization. It helps develop advocates who can speak to you and speak for you to inform the CFO and the audit committee on the good things that you're doing. Keep a track of all of the different areas of improvement, savings made, and it's really critical to spend some time on those annual performance reviews, not just for yourself, but also for the people that report to you. work with them to explain and demonstrate the importance of those, because that's a formal capturing of what the successes are and what the weaknesses are for the organization. And then last, of course, is, so what have we learned? Innovation isn't one size fits all. Stakeholders, partners, and leaders don't have one definition, and they probably can't even articulate what they expect. So you have to ask the hard questions of stakeholders. Know your customers, listen to your customers. Do the simple things, take credit for it. When IA departments are flexible and they serve the business's best interests, they solve problems, take credit for it, and spread the gospel. IA delivers value. We're not just a cost center. And last of all, innovation takes courage. Be willing to enter the fray, have an opinion, do your research on how stuff is done outside your areas of expertise, work with the managers to understand why they think what they think. It's not about being right. It's about developing your relationship with them. So, be open to being wrong. Innovation isn't innovation just taking what we learned from our careers and incorporating management views and meeting their needs? It's just a little bit more than actionable intel. So I really appreciate your time. And again, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email or even pick up the phone and give me a call. Be happy to chat with you about some of the things that your organization is doing and how you guys are being innovative.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that expert talk. I think that was great. And we learned a lot about innovation being part of the internal audit brand. You shared some great concepts and some great stories and to help us understand, like I said, that concept better. And please, all attendees, reach out to Tom, take advantage of his offer, and keep the conversation going. All right. Well, thank you so much, Tom, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Linda.